Hello everyone. So here we are with our last session of CIE Part 1 course, and in this entire series of videos we have covered all the key concepts and terminologies in the CIE Part 1 course. All these units were compiled and the lectures were compiled based on the GLIM study material. So if you are using that, it will pretty much help you in understanding all the concepts. However, even if you aren't using, the key crux of the entire CIA concept remains the same, irrespective of whichever publisher you are following. As usual, this is a brief introduction about myself and my career trajectory and my qualification, just to give an idea that whatever information I'm coming or I'm explaining to you in terms of the concepts and all is based on the wide experience I have and the knowledge I have from different qualification and my diverse experience. So here, and this is a snapshot of the entire CIE Part 1 course. Out of we have 7 units in the GLIM course content, and out of 7 we have already covered 6 units, and today's is our last unit about fraud risk and controls, which make about 10% of the entire syllabus, and approximately 13 MCQs comes from this area. If you look in the entire CIE Part 1 course, you will figure out there are 5 key elements. We talk about the foundation of internal auditor, some basics about internal audit. Then we discuss our certain terminologies and concepts related to internal audit. The third thing is about corporate governance. The fourth is about risk, and the fifth about controls. So we have 2 units regarding risk, which is risk management, unit 4 and 7, fraud risk. And we have 2 units regarding controls. We have controls related to types and framework and application. So it has been broken down into 2 units. I would have personally preferred if the unit 7 was after unit 4, because it makes much more sense. But anyhow, this is how it has been compiled in the GLIM study material. The Unit 7 fraud risk has 3 basically components. If we can break down into 3 components, the first one is about fraud risk and the types of fraud which are being committed. So that is one section. The second section is about the fraud controls, which touch base upon what are the key controls to mitigate or manage the fraud risk. And the last one is about the fraud investigation. This is very critical, that to understand what is the role of internal auditor in fraud investigation, and where we can play our role, and how we can add value in terms of fraud investigation. So whenever we talk about fraud, the first thing we have to do is to define what is fraud. So just to have a brief and very quick explanation of fraud. Fraud is any illegal act characterized by the deceit, concealment, and violation of trust. So basically, if we violate someone's trust, if we manipulate something, or if we try to play overly smart for any wrongful intention, that constitute fraud. The definitions are many, but this is the crux of fraud definition. Effects of fraud, there are 2 effects. One is monetary, and the other one is the failure of governance within a structure. Even the monetary value to determine a fraud is not so easy, because majority of the frauds are not being even properly evaluated or highlighted, because the element of shame or bad publicity associated with fraud. From my personal experience, I have noticed that there are many companies which encounter fraudulent incident, but at the end they try to manage it, or um, the remedy which they look forward is within the closed doors, which means either they carry out a settlement with the fraudulent, sometimes they terminate the person. It's very rare that they file a lawsuit against the culprit unless until it's massive huge amount of fraud, or just in case if it is publicly exposed, that incident. um, the reason why, because the fraud has already been occurred, and the companies they fear bad publicity, and because of that the management especially are not willing to have a reputational damage, which might sometimes even cost more than the fraud which already happened. However, and the general stance within the companies are that there are zero tolerance for fraud. But again, just by putting a policy is not enough. You have to ensure that there is a culture that that enable people to feel secure, and if anyone does anything wrong, they will be held accountable for, and there will be a just and right procedures or in place, justice system that will prevail. So in that case, the fraudulent incident decline, but otherwise it's difficult to manage. Characteristic of fraud. So whenever we say that um, why someone commit a fraud and how it happened, we have a famous model, we call it fraud triangle, basically, where there are three elements. We believe that it has to be in parallelly or in conjunction. It has to work together in order for a person to be able and successfully be able to commit a fraud. The first thing is pressure, which means that a person, whoever is a convict or who is trying to perpetuate a fraud, he might be under any pressure to carry out that wrongful act. So generally, as a human being, no one likes to play a villain role or do a wrong thing. But there are circumstances where you might feel under pressure. For example, you are in a financial distress position where you need money immediately, maybe for the treatment of your some of your loved ones. Maybe you are in a heavy debt and you have to make a payment, otherwise there might be a legal proceeding. Your child admission is due and you have to pay the fee and you do not have that. There could be hundreds and millions of reasons why a person feel pressured. Sometimes it is also because that there are unrealistic targets within the company where you are being pushed to the limits that if you do not achieve those targets, you might you might face a consequences, maybe a termination, or sometimes your bonuses are associated with a certain kind of financial growth or financial targets, which lead you to be more aggressive toward achieving those targets. So this is all constitute as a pressure, a reason why you want to commit a fraud. Let me tell you, majority of the fraudulent incidents and high profile incident happen, and they are being sometimes carried out by people who have never committed a fraud and they do not have the history. It is because of these pressures that which lead someone to carry out or to to get into these troubling activities. The second thing is opportunity. Opportunity means that the person who he got that ill intent to carry out a fraud, he also see a foreseeable or an environment where he can commit that fraud. For example, he is the highest person in the company and he has a lot of autonomy in deciding certain action or taking certain decision. For example, uh, the person might be under financial distress and he the procurement head and he has the full authority to grant the procurement quota to any of the supplier, and he decided to go with one who might give him a kickback or a bribe. So technically he might say that, I'm just giving anyway, he's the right person, so why to go with Y, whereas X is giving me an in financial incentive, and there is no harm because the company, you're paying for those goods, and the company is receiving those services or goods. So the opportunity is there, and some of the key controls in such situation is lack of segregation of duties, where one person has too much of information or too much of authority and autonomy. um, Experienced people commit most of the time heavy losses, heavy fraudulent activities which lead to heavy losses. The less or newbies or the one who are in the start of their career, they commit a smaller because of their they have less of authority to commit. So lack of control generally leads an opportunity for someone to execute a fraudulent activity. The last thing in the fraud triangle, which are one of the necessary thing that's a person might might enable a person to carry out a fraud, is realization or rationalization. It means that by nature human beings are programmed in a good um, in a good manner in which they feel bad for doing anything bad. So you have to satisfy your inner self, your soul, that because everyone knows if someone commits a wrong act, unless until it's a negligence. But generally, if you are intentionally doing a wrong thing, you might realize that it's not the right thing to do, but you might still go about it. So you have to justify to yourself to have a peaceful sleep at night, or to do that wrong act. And generally people rationalize that maybe the company is not fair. I should be getting more pay since I'm not getting, so it's okay to steal something from the company or to cheat the company in terms of working hours, or get something from. And like in the example of a procurement head or procurement manager who just take a bribe by granting the contract to a specific supplier, though he might be a competitive, he might be offering a competitive rate. But the thing is, why to bribe? Because if everyone start doing the same thing, the entire governance structure get affected by. I will just give you a practical example which I have seen in my practical life, that there was an MD of a company um, who bought a very expensive house, and he does not want to go to the bank because the bank charges the interest, and sometimes they ask for collateral and all. So what he did, because he was very much autonomous in looking after all the factory and everything, and the owner has a lot of trust because he was serving with them for more than 2 decades. What he did, he take out the amount of that amount from his from the company, and no one stops him because the internal audit was pretty much non-existent in that company. And he granted himself a loan without even disclosing to the board members or the owners of the company, and without having any proper policy. And later on, when we carry out an investigation, we came to know that this person has rationalized himself that anyways, I was not intent to take away that money, and I was paying from my monthly salary a certain portion against that loan which I have obtained, and it is documented. But the thing is, have you informed the board? No. Was there any policy? No. And if you were with the right intention, why didn't you disclose at the first place? They might have granted you this right as well. But just because you feared that there might be a refusal and you would not be able to get this benefit, so you carry out that activity. So he was under pressure because he wanted to buy that expensive house. The controls were weak because there was no as such strong internal audit department within the company, and he was autonomous, and no one can question him because he was the highest authority within that company. And the third thing, rationalization. He rationalized himself by saying that I was paying a certain portion of my salary against that loan which I obtained. So all three elements were there for him to commit that wrongful act. And this is how we understand that when someone commits a fraud, this is the reason why. And these three components needs to be met at least to carry out those activities. So this is a brief explanation that what is the rationale and how and why a good person might commit a fraud. So here we are different types of fraud. So one needs to understand all these types. You don't have to memorize. You just need to have a good understanding of that. There are different ways of committing a fraud, and eventually, no matter which way you use, it's a wrongful act, and it needs to be condemned. So asset misappropriation is a very common and approach where you take the company assets or you take the company cash. Um, for example, you're working in a company and you found uh, something in the inventory of the company and you just take it away and you said it's fine, it's a smaller amount. Even honestly, to my belief, small stationaries that are in seems to be immaterial within the company should not be taken as for your own personal use. We should be morally responsible to believe that everything that the company owns it belongs to them, and against that they pay you a wage or a salary. And if there is something that the company wants to give you, that's a separate story. um, if there is an incident that where you use but after the approval, then it's fine. So using company car for your personal use, using company or withholding cash obviously or anything, um, that is not the right thing to do. So asset misappropriation generally happen in the company because there is assets or inventory, or there are things which are lying down, and people use it wrongfully. Skimming is the second type of fraud, which means that you take the cash before it is being recorded. For example, you are a person who's in sales and who is also responsible to collect the cash from retail shops. So you deliver the inventory and then you collect the cash from them. So there might be possibility that you are out of cash and you use that company cash and using somewhere else, and even without even letting anyone record it. So there might be people, especially those who are in charge of collecting cash, and they might use it for personal reasons, and without even the recording happen, because once you receive the cash, then you have to um, uh, give a deposit to the finance, or if there is any procedures. I have found one incident in my career where the the salespeople, they were issuing a wrong receipts to the retailers whenever they drop the inventory. These retailers, they pay for those inventory, and they were issuing a wrong receipts, so just to let them know that this is the evidence against the payment. And sometimes they say that there are damages where the product get damaged, so you can claim that there were damages. Obviously there needs to be a good controls to verify that whether these items are being damaged or not. Or sometimes there are samples, so even he was selling the samples. And so when we went to visit those shops, we came to know that the receipts which they have and the receipts which he submitted was of different number and different, so it was completely fake receipts which he was giving, and he was making his own receipts which were he was submitting in the company. So skimming is this concept. Payment fraud is generally when you make a fictitious goods or services and the company make a payment against it. For example, you say that the company has received certain kind of services and there is need for payment, and the payment is being made but the service is not received or the goods are not received. So this is a payment fraud. Expenses reimbursement fraud is very common, especially travel related expenses where people make a fictitious invoices, inflated rates. For example, they had a dinner at a restaurant and they just ask the person to that you will pay the actual price, but they ask him to put an extra amount in the invoice. It happens in some smaller shops, but it cannot happen in a big one, obviously. But this is just a very lame example which I'm trying to give you. But generally, it happened. For example, the guy who has to buy something for the company, he said that okay, let's put to the vendor, let's put certain amount in the invoice and we will split the extra amount between 50-50. So there could be hundreds of scenarios, but it is just to give you an understanding that how expense reimbursement fraud happens. Sometimes you fake the invoices, so that also happen. Payroll fraud is more associated when you do not have an employee or the employee has left, but still the salary is going on. Sometime the people I have witnessed this as well, where one employee who already left the company, the guy in the accounts or who's responsible for managing the bank accounts of those people, he without any approval changed the bank account of that left employee to his personal account and didn't mark him as a person who already left the company. So the salary was being paid to that employee for more than a year and a half when we discovered that incident. So it apparently looks like very impossible thing to do because of all the controls and everything, but companies are sometimes so complex. There are thousands of employees and there might be an oversight, there might be a system error, people override, sometimes people collude, 2 3 people collude together to commit a fraud. So that also happened. Financial statement misrepresentation is the very executive level kind of a fraud where the senior management try to portray a better picture of the company, so they carry out certain changes within the financial statement through different exemptions, so that lead to a misrepresentation. Why they do it? They might be under pressure to meet certain targets or to reduce the tax or any other reason it could be. um, Information misrepresentation, again, it's very common in the corporate world where you give a wrong information about what is happening within the company or about any event or in transaction. So that's very pretty obvious. And corruption is the improper use of the power. So where you let a person do something where he shouldn't be doing that thing, and so that constitutes as corruption. Some more example of different types of fraud: bribery, obviously, which is interlinked with corruption, by which we pay to as a kickback or as a money to someone for them to do something for us, maybe take an approval or accelerate the process or do something which is legitimate, is illegitimate. Conflict of interest is where you prioritize your interests over the company interest in a commercial or in a business setup, and basically whatever wherever there is a conflict of interest, you need to disclose that within the company. So for example, if you're working with two companies and both of the companies are competitor, so you have to disclose. If the company is okay with that, it's fine, because in the given circumstances they will look at if there is a problem, or if the company interest is being defeated or being ignored, then only they will not grant you the permission. But sometimes they do grant you permission as well. So you have to see that if you feel that there might be for example, you want to be a supplier to the company, you might be a consultant to the company, so or your brother or any of your family member you want to introduce to the company for any services or benefits. So all that needs to be disclosed to the compliance department within the company, and after their approval, generally you go for such kind of transactions. So conflict of interest when you prioritize your personal interest over the company interest or shareholder interest. Diversion is a mechanism or a technique by which um, the company pay but do not get the services because of the diversion. For example, one of the case in my career, I will explain to you that the emails of the company were compromised, and as a result, there was an person or a culprit uh, who 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 sent the email uh, on behalf of the senior management of the company to the finance that kindly release this much of the payment to that vendor under this new account details. Um, and these people, these perpetrators are very much clever. They have a lot of patience. They wait. They keep on read the email trails, and they understand the business, and then they commit because a sudden change in the accounts might not be possible for finance to entertain. But since they know the context that such kind of a payments keep on going to that person, so let's do. And unfortunately, in that incident which I have encountered, that the company made the payment, but they instantaneously found that this was not initiated by the intended user, this email. How? Because the finance person um, had a meeting with that person, and just in the meeting, he just out of the way, he said, I entertain your email of the payment with the new account details. He said, for what? And then he gave the context, and he said, no, it is not being initiated by me. So the email was compromised, the system of the company was compromised. But the good thing was that when we immediately called to the bank stopped that payment. And it was not initiated because the weekend was coming, and so we save on that money. But this is called a diversion. A wrongful use is wrong use of information, wrong use of any of the company assets. Related party fraud is when you are the company and you have a subsidiary and associates, and they deals with the parent company with not an arm's length transaction. Means um, you are a company manufacturer of certain things, and then you have a company who has fleets, so transportation company. So you charge either over the market or under the market or below the market, and just to show either more expenses or less expenses. Sometimes you show more expenses within the company in your transaction to avoid taxes, and sometimes you show less expenses and more revenue to show the good performance of the company. It could be for any other reasons, but generally related party transactions happens within the group entities. So that is one also a form of a fraud. And tax evasion in the last is the most common one. Generally the company whitewash tax evasions by doing corporate social responsibility, which is not even a fraction of the price of the amount of tax which they try to avoid. um, Tax avoidance is fine if it is legal, but evasion is when you take a wrongful act and you do it by manipulating certain things. So that is criminal activity. Types of fraudulent process. So there are different types of. There are basically two types which are given in the context of the CIA course, but generally there could be even more. Lapping receivables is when you, for example, you receive amount from one customer, right, and it was a debtor, so we receive from our debtor one amount, the amount, and the person was who collect that amount was in need of cash, so he used it for his personal use, and now he doesn't have anything to show to the company that he has received. But during that time he received the amount from another customer which he adjusted against the previous one, and he keep on doing that thing till either he paid back the same amount to the company or someone discovered that incident. So this is called lapping receivables. Check hitting is a form of fraud which is, honestly speaking, these days it's not so easy to commit. It was in the old days. But I just wonder maybe there are places where it's still happening. Basically, when you issue a check for as a payment mode, despite knowing that you do not have enough money in your bank account, and the um, bank transaction takes 2 to 3 days for clearing that check. So during that time, you just put some money in the bank before it get bounced, and you keep on issuing such kind, and there is a lapping period, or there is a period with 1 or 2 days where you have some cushion to fill that amount, or to deposit that amount in the bank. So this was a kind of a old days technique. I am not so sure. These days we have instant payment, online payments. Generally, services are being delivered after receipts of the payments. So I'm not so sure it happened still during these days, but this is one of the way, or benefiting from the process while committing a fraud. So now we have two interesting more topics, which is symptoms of fraud and fraud committed by whom. Okay, so symptoms of fraud means that um, there are certain pattern which you might observe whenever there is there is conviction of a fraud. Documentary symptoms is that the documents of the company are being faked or being altered. So this is one way of people committing fraud. So being as an auditor, we check on the we check the documents. For example, in the expense claim, we always ask for to see whether the actual invoices are being attached or a photocopy, or if there is an altered document in terms of agreement and all. So there is a different way. We just don't look at the document, but we see the corresponding event, and we see circumstantial evidences that supports that document. Sometimes there are major databases, maybe a regulatory body or some other websites where you can check the authenticity of the data. So there are different ways of, but generally documentary symptoms of a fraud, if it has been perpetrated, is that the documents are being altered, or it's a fake document. Lifestyle symptoms, whoever commit a fraud, generally they you will find that they are living beyond their means, which means that they might be driving an expensive car which does not justify his salary or his income. One of the cases which I know, which was reported in the media, was that there was a telecom company, and there was one agent of that telecom company. He was a low level employee, and who was responsible to issue a SIMs. So strangely, people find that he was driving a very expensive sport car, which he could not even technically cannot afford. Later on, it came to know after investigation that he was, whenever you have a, he was first of all issuing. I do not remember exact details, but he was issuing the company's SIMs, um, by asking for a price. Maybe it was like a free sims, but he was asking for a price. And sometime what happened, that people come with an adjustment to their postpaid bills. He make false claims that they were not justified for such kind of a payment, or it is over payments made by the company by something doing, and he adjusted their bills, and as a result he take a cutback from these people. So there was certain kind of this kind of transactions which he was doing. But anyways, the crux of the situation is that he was living beyond his means. So if someone cannot technically afford to buy $1 million house or $2 million house, because he is living paycheck to paycheck, but now he owns it, either he got a lottery, or there might be that he is doing something wrong. So that's one of the symptoms. It doesn't mean that the person has committed a fraud. It just means that you have to take into account that thing in the company, in the corporate structure, that are people living within their means or not. Behavioral symptoms, that these bad activity, it always lead to stress and anxiety. no matter how much we try to overcome, but still, even if we rationalize it, somewhere in our heart we feel that it's something that were not supposed to do. So if a person is in constant stress or guilt for something, then you might know that there might be a possibility, if we have other that if he's living over beyond his means, um, and if you believe that he has an authority where he can be, there is an opportunity to commit a fraud, there might be a possibility. So these are just the symptoms, but you have to just take into account, and from the exam perspective you just need to understand the concepts and see if a situation is being given, so you can see whether it's belongs to which system, or these kind of MCQs. uh, if a if a fraud is committed by a low level staff, is generally about stealing something, maybe something from the company manufactures something, they just take it out, um, or any of the assets, or um, so that's or cash maybe. So generally low level staff go for such kind of activity. High level executive, they manipulate the financial information of the company, or information within the company. So misappropriation of assets might lead, might be things which happen at the very top, but at an executive level, corporate. So the executives are more concerned about the financials of the company. So so this is a distinction where you need to know that generally people with less authority will commit a smaller and stealing kind of a thing, and people with a higher authority, they will manipulate in terms of bigger numbers, in terms of financials of the company, for their own incentive, or maybe they are under pressure. So here we are with some fraud risk and types. Under that section, we are with some red flags. So red flags are indicators that you have to be aware of in order to scan things around and see while doing even the audit. Because if you are aware of those red flags or indicators, you might be better in a position to identify or to spot on any fraudulent incident. If these are basically lack of controls, we call it. So lack of employee rotation. So if there is no in the sensitive areas, for example in procurement, sometime in the finance department, there is a policy within the company that the employees needs to be rotated. So if someone is reluctant to be rotated, it means that he might have set up a system by which he is trying to take out his personal benefit out of the company processes, and doesn't want a new person to come and discover. So this could be a possibility. Lack of clear job description. This happens most of the time within the company, that it's so complex and companies are changing very fast with the dynamic environment, so no one knows who's doing what, and as a result, when people say that they can get rid of the responsibility and accountability, they might commit a fraud. So job descriptions needs to be very much in line with what the person is doing, because that's how you establish the accountability. The third thing is segregation of duties. So if one person is, as I've given you the example of the MD or GM of the company who committed a fraud, because there was no one to ask him. Sorry, but my point here is lack of segregation of duties. Lack of segregation of duties is when someone has ultimate authority for initiating, executing, and finalizing and receiving the payments of a transaction. Um, for example, a person who is who can take the lead on who should be onboarded, and who should be made payments to, uh, and so if he has the control over the process, then it's a high possibility that he commit by himself. But if there are two or three people involved in that transaction, then the possibility is reduced. For example, if you need to have a reviewer, an approval, an initiator, and the collector, these four people in a purchase department, separate people, then they have to collude together in order to commit that fraud, that all get together, otherwise they wouldn't be. So that could be a right example. Ambitious sales and production goals, this has happened at the executive level or sales teams, sometime marketing team, which are being pushed to the limits. So if you are being pushed to the limits, you might manipulate the results just to show that you are doing your job, and as a result, it happens in the investment banking where your clients, you have to bring investments to the company, or you have to bring rich clients, or you have to manage portfolios. So in that case, it might lead to commit a fraud. Employee refuses to take vacation. This happened. We this I have seen in my practical example, in practical experience, where there was a procurement manager. First of all, he was autonomous, and he was talking to the suppliers. He was finalizing whose vendor with whom we'll be dealing with, and he was the one who approved the payments for those vendors. And so we asked his subordinate that what happened when he goes on vacation. He said no, he doesn't go on vacation, he's such a hard-working person. Later on, we came to know that he established a company by his wife name and his mother-in-law name, and he was supplying the products to the company at inflated prices. um, Obviously there was then things, remedial things happen, some lawsuits and all, but generally when an employee refuses to take vacation, this could be an indicator. Control overrides means that when you defeat the control within the systems or people, you say that there is no need for a review, there is no need for an approval, or a person just remove that from the transaction, or sometime you override means you execute the transaction without certain approvals. So that could lead to also a fraud. High reported high reported profit despite competitor or economic downturn. So if one company in the entire sector of that industry is performing amazingly, despite we know that there is no contributing factor that that sector can boom within such a competitive environment, then we have to be a little bit skeptical, and then we have to dig down more why, how the company is making more money. The example which I've seen in my practical experience is there was one company which was doing outperforming his competitors within the sector. Later on, we came to know that the sales teams, the GM of the sales, was bribing certain individuals in certain undeveloped countries or developing countries to get to get the orders for the company. So that is not being acceptable. So that's how we discover it. So this might also be a symptom for or indicator for committing of I mean as a red flag for the fraud. Sole sourcing, when you are only buying from one person, so that could be also disproportionate increase in sales versus cost of sales. So cost of sales is the direct cost, which means that if your sales increases proportionately, your cost of sales will increase. But you are saying that your sales are increasing but your cost remains constant, so then you have to dig down why is that happening. So that's one could be indicator. Actual product differ from requisition. So you pay for a high quality and you get a bad quality, you pay for a higher quantity, you get a lesser quantity. So this could be also an indicator or symptom. Petty cash not handled through impress accounts. So impress accounts basically is the account which are being formally managed for small purchases within the company. Let's say $100,000 of impress amount the company maintains. So if they have consumed around 20,000 or 50 or 60,000 from that fund against certain purchases, so they raise a requisition to the finance that we have to you have to replenish the impressum fund or account. To do that, the finance asks for all the invoices, original invoices. They verify whether they have spent on a correctly, and they reconcile, and then they release the fund. So if you do not have, you just go every time to the finance and take some cash and pay for something, then there could be a possibility that it might lead to a fraudulent activity as well. This is very important slide because there are certain misconception about internal auditors in regards to what their role is towards identifying or investigating fraud. So we needs to be clear about these things, and we should educate people around us as an auditor that what is the role of internal auditor. uh, Internal auditors are not responsible for investigating a fraud, for the detection of all frauds, but rather they are responsible to alert if there is a possibility of a fraud. So if we feel that there are indicators which might give an assumption that there might be a fraud, so we can alert, but this is not our primary responsibility that we should detect a fraud knowledge. We needs to have good sufficient knowledge about the fraud risk, but we are not supposed to be an expert of investigation. What does it mean? Because it means that there are people who are very hardcore experts in forensics, because of their experience, because of their trainings. So they, and because of the technicalities involved in fraud. Sometimes the fraud does not only happen in terms of financials. It happens in the operations of the company. There could be certain other kind of a fraud. So we might not have the competence. If an auditor have, then they can, but if they don't, they shouldn't. Fraud risk assessment, we are responsible. We have to carry out a fraud risk assessment, evaluate controls and design, and apply an audit procedure to ensure that there is no exposure to the fraud risk. But in certain kind of fraud in investigation, high profile or some technical that needs to be carried out by technical people, unless until we have the competence. um, Fraud indicators, yes, we need to be aware of all the red flags and the indicators which we have discussed in the previous slides. That's one of our role. Recommendation, auditors can recommend for an fraud investigation based on the indicators. If they feel there is enough of evidence and a ground for an investigation, they can highlight that risk to the audit committee or to the board or to the management that this area needs to be further dig down in order to identify that if there is any fraud happening or not. So now we are entering the second section of the unit 7. The first one was about the fraud risk and types of fraud, and the second is about fraud controls, and the third will be about fraud investigation. So here we talk about the fraud programs. So fraud programs are um, um, a mechanism that is being devised within the company by which we try to give an awareness to the people that what is fraud, what are the indicators, to look around, to be vigilant, and to oppose them of even having that illicit thought about having committing a fraud. So awareness is important. Prevention is important when you put proper controls in place within the company. There is less likelihood that the people might incur or the occurrence of the fraud reduce. um, Proper reviews, proper approvals, safeguarding of assets, checking, inspection, audits. So these all leads to a company policy and culture and environment, zero tolerance for fraud. This all leads to an effective internal control in terms of managing the fraud risk. Detection program is also important. Sometimes you put everything to the best of your ability, but still something goes wrong. So then you have to carry out an investigation, and post investigation you need to fix those problems if there was any. So these are the three components in the awareness, prevention, and detection in a fraud program. Fraud related controls, some of the controls are being specified in the ethics policy. So basically we want employees to be of high morale, and they should not be doing anything wrong and for that we give them the awareness, and we state what constitute fraud and what are the consequences and what it happened, how we will be investigating, So this all being defined and put it forward in the ethics policy. So that is one of the controls that we place in order to ensure that people do not commit fraud. Fraud awareness trainings are being held within the companies. Fraud risk assessment is being carried out by the risk management team, by the internal auditors, by the fraud control or anti-fraud department if a company have, to ensure that the whenever they carry out a risk assessment, they also look things from the perspective of fraud, that if things go wrong in that way, are there any controls that are being deployed to manage that risk. Ongoing reviews and approvals. This is an effective mechanism by which you segregate the duties and responsibility among people, and that help to reduce fraud. Prevention and detection. Prevention is again the controls, and detection is when someone committed fraud. Then we look and identify, not only to see that who is responsible, but also to look for the loophole and try to fix it. Investigation. So whenever we have to have an unfortunate incident, then we have to investigate, and while investigation has a certain protocols, who will be carrying out the fraud, who will be giving the approval to carry out the fraud, how it will be done, will that person whoever is being put it as a perpetrator of fraud should be allowed to work during that time, or should not be, or should be suspended for the time of investigation. How the documentary evidence will be gathered, who will have the custody of the information, who will decide on the final outcome, how the legal suit will take place, so how the damages will be recovered, or what will be the remedy. So this all is being taken into account in terms of investigation protocols. Here we are entering in the third section of our unit 7, which is fraud investigation. In the previous two sections which we covered was about types of fraud, fraud risk and controls. So this is the section where we will be discussing exclusively about investigation, who is responsible, what are the ways of doing it, in the coming few slides. The management, the first point, the management is responsible to develop policies and procedures in regards to the fraud. They have to ensure that all the evidences are being preserved properly during any investigation. Respond to the results. For example, if someone made liable, um, then how you respond, that needs to be taken like fairly, um, and the action of the management should be fair and transparent. The fourth thing is reporting, that you should fairly report whatever happened and the entire details about the fraudulent incident. And the last thing is communication, that to whom it has to be reported, internally, externally, to regulators. So that all depends, and there should be a proper mechanism and protocol that needs to be followed, and this is all the responsibility related to the management. um, Sorry. There are certain skills that are important for investigating a fraud incident, because these these incidents go for legal proceedings, legal suits, civil, all criminal uh, suits. So that's why we need to have someone who is very expert in it and know how to challenge the allegation, or to prove that allegation against someone in the court. So that's why it's not something which can be taken lightly. Therefore, we do not mandate the investigation part by the auditor, but the auditor can do. So if we feel that the auditor doesn't have the competence, then we have to find a person who is competent enough, a professional, maybe forensic investigator or something, who can come and carry out that engagement. Um, the skills, accounting and auditing obviously helps in the investigation part, but there are other behavioral skills or legal understanding of the nature of the law. So that's also important. Um, Auditor, liars, and other specialists could be could act as an investigator. If an auditor are responsible to carry out a fraud investigation within the company, that needs to be defined in the charter, and it has to be part of the fraud policy. Um, to be efficient fraud investigation team, you need to have sufficient knowledge about fraud schemes. There are different types of schemes, which we have discussed earlier also, like asset misappropriation, corruption, bribe, skimming. These are the schemes. So you need to be aware of those schemes. Investigation method, there could be tons of ways how you investigate the matter. And third is applicable laws, because generally these fraudulent cases end up in the court. Lead investigator is the one who is the responsible and who decide whether he has in-house competence to investigate or he needs to outsource. uh, One of the things that we need to be mindful in fraud investigation, generally the conflict of interest is one of the element that lead to a fraudulent activity, which means that someone is giving himself or herself more priority over the company. So that one thing which you need to be mindful about. All the evidences needs to be chronologically be put it in place. For example, we have to put it dates and times of the incident that happened. um, from, let's say, an incident happened last month, so we say that the evidence of that person entering on the 1st of March in the premises, then he takes certain things at 5 p.m. the same day, then he did not appear to the office the next 2 days, then he applied for a leave on that day. So chronologically all the evidences should be made for having a trail and understanding of how the scheme was being perpetrated and how things being committed. So this is one of the protocols that we have to follow. Investigation should be coordinated. Obviously any investigation when happens, so we have to coordinate with our legal counsel, maybe the auditors of the company, the management of the company, some other departments. So that's coordination needs to be taken into place. The evidence needs to be secured and the chain of the custody shall be followed. So the chain of custody and the evidence preservation is so much important, because you can make someone liable only if you have the evidences, right? So the preservation of evidences, the chain of evidences, and the custody, and who's responsible to safeguard that evidence is very much important. One thing we have to be mindful about fraud fraud cases, that the interrogation which take place in the fraud is very much different from the normal general interviews which we carry out, even basic understanding during our audit execution or during our audit procedures. um, in the normal course of a business, we go from general to specific, so we understand the business, we understand the process, then we ask some specific question. However, it happened absolutely opposite of that. You are very specific about the questions which you want to put it forward in front of the person while doing an interrogation. Even the techniques differ. You have to observe his physical um, attributes in terms of is he stressed out, is he sweating, does he maintain an eye contact. You reveal certain facts to see how he react. Does he confess his fraud or not? I did CFE, so Certified Fraud Examination certification. In that, we were being taught that how to have an investigation. There was a full course on investigation in that course. So there they were very specific about how you carry out an investigation, interrogation. In investigation, whenever the investigation is happening, we have to suspend that employee for time being. So there is no a possibility that the person destroy the evidences or manipulate the information. So just this is one of the key initiatives we take whenever we are investigating any fraud cases. In related to fraud reporting, obviously the internal auditor are responsible to inform about if there is a fraud happening, and they report about the fraud. They might not be the investigator, but they have to inform to the audit committee that there is an investigation going on and this was the final report and all. Any draft report of the forensic audit or fraud investigation needs to be discussed and reviewed by the general counsel of the company or legal counsel of the company. Because these are sensitive matters, you might end up in the court, so you don't want to messed up with from the legal perspective. So you have to be very vigilant, and if the auditor is investigator, then they have to go. But anyways, you have to go to the legal counsel before issuing the final report. Any significant fraud shall be timely reported. This is very much important because the timing is so vital, because it can differentiate between a smaller damage to the company to the very massive bigger damage to the company. So that timing is important, so you have to timely inform to take, so that the management or the board can take a timely course of action to manage that risk. Uh, so let's say that the forward engagement has been concluded, the report has been issued. So now how we can go about in terms of resolution of the fraud incident? There are certain things that we needs to take into account. For example, resolving. So the management and the board is responsible primarily for resolving that fraud incident. In a sense, whoever is being put or alleged for a fraud uh, commit whether they have committed a fraud or not, but they were found innocent, so we have to reinstate in terms of their responsibility, and we have to respect them, and we should be very much clear about that these people were being interrogated during the investigation phase, but they are clean. So that needs the closure to a person, uh, innocence, that needs to be done. Discipline, these if a person has committed a minor fraud, maybe out of negligence, maybe out of intention, whatever, um, we have to discipline by giving warnings or setting an example for others to follow. Financial restitution is when we ask for the damages to be paid by the employee, so or whoever is a party. Contract termination, if we feel that our vendor or our supplier, they have they are in breach of certain terms and conditions, or they have committed a fraud, then we terminate the contract. So that's termination is important. Now, law enforcement, where we feel that the legal institution needs to be onboarded, so we have to report on in that aspect as well. Civil suits, if there is a need for, so we file civil or criminal suit. Insurance, we have to file an insurance for the damages if we are insured, and recommendation that how we can fix that problem so it doesn't happen in the future. So these are some of the key attributes that needs to be taken into account while resolving a fraud incident. So now, after resolving the fraud incident, the next step is communication. So to whom we have to communicate about the results, about the entire thing which happened. So the management and the board is primarily responsible to decide on, because sometimes we have to keep things internally within the company. Sometimes we have to inform to the regulatory people, law enforcement agencies. So that communication is the responsibility of the board and the management to decide to whom that information about that incident needs to be disclosed. Opinion of the fraud related controls, the board might ask the internal auditor to give their opinion in regards to the controls which has been employed for managing the fraud risk by the management. So we as an auditor can play a role where we provide an assurance on whether the controls are effective or not, because anyways this is part of our responsibility to have a fraud risk assessment and to see whether there are proper controls functioning or not. So this is the role of the internal auditor, and this is the last point in the entire section. So by this, we have just concluded our fraud risk related unit of the GLIM. Thank you for watching, and here we are at the end of the entire completion of the entire CIA Part 1 course lectures. I'm very much excited. I'm happy that I followed a consistent approach. It was tough. There is a lot of work which I do it in the background in terms of summarizing the concepts, um, trying to explain the concept in a simple manner. Um, I personally found that there are certain section of the GLIM study material which does not do the justice to the topic. They do not go into details, and as a person who doesn't have an internal audit experience might not be able to understand. But overall, they have done a great job in being very concise and to the point, and it's a great study material for those who have some background of internal audit and experience. um, it benefited me, so I hope it will benefit you as well. But just to overcome that lag or that weakness, I try to record all these videos. um, so I hope you like it. Please share your views in the comments, and if you have any improvement suggestion, please do let me know that as well. And do not forget to subscribe, because it will help me and motivate me to put that effort more to record part 2 and part 3. Still a long way to go. And also, do not hesitate to share with other people, because if you benefited, there might be a possibility that other people also be benefited. So in on my channel, I try to not only provide with this only like about the CIA course, but also try to give you some understanding of the key concept related to risk and controls and corporate governance, some business related topics, some personal my personal um, um, experiences, and also on financial management. This is something I really encourage a lot to people, that everyone should be financially literate. We think that we are literate, but actually majority of the people are not. So I made some videos on that as well, so you can watch it whenever you have a spare time. And just pray for me, and that I continue this series and to finish part 2 and part 3, and hope to see you in the next video. And don't forget to subscribe.